All right, we're going to work toward the bottom of page 1 with regard to salt and light in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 13 through 16. 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its savor, how shall it be seasoned? It's thenceforth good for nothing, be cast out and trampled underfoot by men. You're the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a lampstand or a candlestick, so that it gives light to all that are in the house. And let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And so as we look at this particular set of statements by our Lord in this first recorded sermon, in the Sermon on the Mount, we think about, I want to again think about the audience that is under consideration here. That the salt of the earth and the light of the world are not those who, again, just considering audience alone, okay, are not those, Jesus was not, for example, Jesus was not addressing a group of people that might have the so-called importance of the General Assembly of the United Nations. In other words, people who represent entire countries gathered in one place. He didn't tell a group of appointed leaders around the world, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. He had not assembled a group of kings together, but rather these were just, as we might say, just common folk. Just common folk. People that had been hearing about Jesus, had been following Jesus, had seen the miracles of Jesus. And of course, he sits down at the beginning of chapter 5, seeing the multitudes, and opens up his mouth and begins to teach. Now, let me just make one more statement in reference to the Sermon on the Mount. I don't see how there's any way that what we have in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is the entirety of that sermon. And the reason is, you all have heard me preach, some of you have heard me preach this sermon, recite the entirety of the sermon. And it can be done in about 24 minutes. Right? I don't think Jesus gathered thousands and thousands of people and sat down on the side of a mountain and preached for 24 minutes and turned them loose. What we find in this particular sermon are the highlights of many of the. There are probably a lot of things that are in here that Jesus also explained while he was saying them, or he expanded or expounded upon these things. And so, and we know that he preached this particular sermon in more than one context, because this is the Sermon on the Mount, and Luke 6 is called the Sermon on the Plain. And when you read, for example, Luke 6 and starting in about verse 20 through the end of the text, and not only there, but a lot of the same things are in both sermons, and he was in two different places. And so Jesus preached a small body of wisdom everywhere he went, because there was this core knowledge that people needed to have. And so when Jesus would preach it in Hamilton, if he went to Winfield, well, the people in Winfield needed to hear the same thing that Jesus had just taught in Hamilton. And the people in Ewan or Fayette or Jasper or wherever it is that Jesus went, he had this core body of knowledge that everybody needed to hear, these foundational principles. And a lot of times, the really radical things that we'll see later on in the latter part of Matthew 5, for example, you've heard it said, but I say. 5 times in that text, you've heard it said, but I say. And so we want to understand that this is not the entirety of Jesus' teaching on this. And we also understand the audience to whom he is speaking. In other words, these people in the eyes of society, or in the eyes of rulers, these people are nobodies. They're nobodies. And yet Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Now, that's a pretty impressive moniker to hang on somebody, isn't it? Salt of the earth and light of the world. And we've taken that phrase, salt of the earth, and we've minimized it. If we think about a guy who's just a pretty good guy, he's a good neighbor, you can count on him for this and that. He said, man, he's what? He's salt of the earth. He's salt of the earth. But what Jesus had to say about being the salt of the earth was far greater in its import than just being a good neighbor. And he's talking about the preservative powers, the preservative power of salt, the influence that salt has. I read this account concerning salt in preparation. Said there was a king who had 2 daughters. And he asked the first daughter, said, "How much do you love me?" And she said, "I love you more than silver and gold." And he asked the second daughter, he says, "How much do you love me?" She said, "I love you more than salt." And he wasn't too pleased with the answer that the second daughter gave. And apparently he must have said something about it, but his cook overheard him chastise the second daughter. And so the next morning, the cook cooked all of the king's breakfast without even so much as a single grain of salt in it. And when the king couldn't hardly eat it, he asked the chef, he asked the cook, he said, "What in the world have you done to this food?" He said, "I cooked it without any salt." And then the king understood what was going on. In other words, the second daughter was essentially saying, my life is distasteful if you're not in it. You know, my life is dull. In other words, you mean everything to me. Everything that you touch in my life, you make it better. And so he understood. He understood the statement. "I love you more than salt." And again, to think about the preserving factor of salt, to be the salt of the earth. You know, the entire world was destroyed by flood in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. And how many people, how many people preserved the entirety of the human race? 8. 8 souls saved. Hebrews chapter 11. Of course, we know that from reading the account of Noah and Mrs. Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives. But if we really wanted to get down to it, we could even shave it closer than 8, couldn't we? Because the Bible doesn't say Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth found grace in the eyes of the Lord. It didn't say Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were upright men, blameless in their generation. I mean, we can pare this thing down to one man, can't we? Noah. Noah's the linchpin. Noah's the key figure in this. He's the key figure in this account. This man's righteousness, this man's desire to please God saved the entirety of the human race, or preserved the human race. Now, let's fast forward about 10 chapters. Oh, actually, we could pick up in Genesis 13 and 14 and get to Genesis 19. How many people would it have taken in Sodom to save those cities? God told Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and these cities on the plain. And Lot is like, I don't know if I said Noah, but Lot is like, will you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Far be it, Lord, for you to kill righteous people alongside the wicked. He says, what if I can find 50 people? If I can find 50 people, will you spare the cities? If I can find 50, and God said, I'll spare it for 50. He goes, well, what if I just come up 5 short? What about 45? Will you save it for 45? And the Lord said, I'll save it on the account of 45. Well, what about 40? And by the time Lot got finished, he'd pared that thing all the way down to 10. And God said, I'll spare the cities on the account of 10. All it was going to take was 10 righteous people in Sodom to save all of those cities. All those cities. And they could not be found. So you think about the importance of the preserving power of salt. That if Lot could have found 10 people, the account that we read in Genesis 19 would have never taken place, at least not in that particular day and time. And so we think about the importance, the importance of salt. And by the way, if you again thinking about the audience, look, salt's pretty common nowadays, right? We think about it. We don't think about salt in the broad scheme of things, because you can go just about anywhere and get salt. Interestingly enough, some of the largest salt manufacturing plants are in Israel, where Sodom and Gomorrah used to be. You can even see them. You can even see them from satellite imagery. And I told you about going to Africa, where they fill these ponds full of seawater, and they evaporate the water out of those ponds and create salt. In other words, salt is everywhere. Salt is everywhere. But just because it's everywhere doesn't mean it's being put to proper use, right? As Christians, I wrote this down over here on the side. That perhaps we're guilty of being salt shakers. In other words, we're shakers. We're filled with salt, but what good is salt in a shaker? What do you got to do? You got to shake the salt out of it. That's right. You got to get the salt out of the shaker for the salt to be of any count. And all of us as Christians, we're salt shakers. We're filled with salt. But as long as we sit on the sideline, as long as we sit on the shelf, and we don't have the influence that we're supposed to have, we're really no good. It doesn't matter how much salt you have if you don't put it on the food, right? It doesn't matter how much salt you have, and by the way, Jesus is talking about having salt in yourselves. It doesn't matter how much salt we have in ourselves. If that salt stays in the container, it's no good to anybody. And not only that, it's no good to the container. The container's of no use if you don't use the container. And so salt is extremely important as we think about Jesus' statement here in Matthew chapter 5. And now on to light. You're the light of the world. You're the light of the world. Down at the second to the last paragraph, it says, think about the difference between salt and light. Salt influences what it touches, but light's influence is based on what it does. And again, it goes to the idea of salt in the shaker. The salt's got to touch something in order to be effective. But light is efficient or effective or valuable based on what it does. Now, if Jesus, and this is in the text, if Jesus says you are the light of the world, then it's in the text, you can read it. So what does that say about the world? If Christians are the light of the world, what does that say about the world? A lot of darkness. A lot of darkness in the world. Matter of fact, the world is darkness. There's no... In the world itself, there is no light. It is all darkness. The world is all darkness. And the Christian and the Word of God and those things that pertain to the kingdom of God, those are the things that radiate light. Those are the things that radiate light. The world does not have any light. The world does not radiate any light. Now, I love the last paragraph. Why are we light? It says, we are not light because of our inherent goodness. We are light because of our connection with the source of light. And that is, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. John 9 and verse 4. In John 1, verses 4 and 5. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made, and in Him was life, and that life was the light of men. Now it's talking about Jesus. The life of Jesus was light for men. Jesus shows men the way, all men. No one else can show us the way other than Jesus. That life is the light of men. Jesus said in John 3 in verse 19, after the golden text, and for the Son of Man did not come to the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. And then here's what He said about the world. He says, the world does not love the light. Why doesn't the world love the light? Because the light exposes the wickedness that's in the world. Yeah. It reminds me of stories my dad and my uncles used to tell about. Back behind my uncle's house years ago, there was a big old barn behind the house, and they set up floodlights in that barn, and they'd go out there in the middle of the night, and everybody would get on the corner with their 22 rifles, and somebody flips on the light, and what do you see when the lights get flipped on? What is it? Rats! Everywhere! You flip on the light and there's the rats. So what do? Man, they just start hammering with them 22s. Pow, 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 pow. And what do the rats do? They run. But as soon as you flip the light back off, if you'll wait about 5 minutes, guess what? They come back and you flip the lights on and you hammer again. That's what the world is like. When the lights come on, the world is going to scatter. The world doesn't want any part of that light. But when you turn the light off, what happens? The world gets to have its way again. That's why people in the world don't, they don't love light. They don't love what is good and right. I don't know if any of you saw, I posted just a little clip of one of my favorite apologists. His name is Frank Turek, Turek. And Turek was, in this clip, said one thing before I start any discussion with an agnostic or an atheist, unbeliever, whatever you want to call him. He says, here's the question I asked him. I said, if Christianity is true, will you become a Christian? And you know what he said they all say? No. No. If I can prove to you that Christianity is true, will you become a Christian? No. Now wait a minute. And his point is, the infidel claims they're the depositories or the repositories of reason, right? We're the smart ones. We're the ones that use reason and logic, right? That's what they say. But then when you ask them, if I can prove a thing is true, will you believe it? And then they say, no. Tells you what? They're really not interested in truth. They want what they want. That's why so many people reject the teaching of the Bible, not because the Bible is unproven, not because the Bible is unprovable, not because Christianity doesn't have an incredible track record of changing lives for thousands of years. People reject it because they want to be their own God. Now, I've read to you on a number of occasions the quotes of Aldous Huxley, who was a late 19th, early 20th century British philosopher. And basically, here's what he said. He said, we rejected the idea of God, not because we couldn't find evidence for God, but because we found it easier to do what we wanted to do if we didn't believe that God existed. In other words, if we just choose to believe there is no God, and by the way, he expressly said in that statement, the belief in God inhibited our sexual freedom. That's what he said. In other words, we wanted to do what we wanted to do. But the idea of God made that difficult for us to do, so we just decided we'd assume that there is no God. Not because we found evidence that there is no God, but because the idea of God prohibited us from doing what we wanted to do. Now see, that's darkness. That's darkness. Christians are light. We're to be light, and light chases away darkness. And again, I'll just use this as an example. How much light does it take to chase away darkness? If we could turn out all these lights and seal all the doorways to where it was black as the bottom of a cave. Y'all ever been in the bottom of a cave, an old mine or something? We used to go up to Farmington and go down in the mines. We'd go down 100, 200 feet. And the first thing they'd do when they get down there is they'd turn the lights off. And look, and invariably I did this to myself every single time. Just to see how dark it was. And literally, you cannot see your hand in front of your face. It is absolutely 100%, utterly, totally dark. You know, but what if a man were to strike a little old wooden match in that cave? What would happen? Everybody could see. Everybody in that cave could see. And by the way, if you turned off the lights in that sense and somebody did light a candle, what is immediately going to happen? Everybody's going to look at that candle, aren't they? The moment that light comes forth, people are going to look at that candle. They cannot help but be drawn to it. When they realize how dark it is where they are, they cannot help but put their eyes on the light. Now, herein lies the problem with the world. The world doesn't understand how dark it is. They think they can see. You know, Jesus talked about this to the Jewish leaders. He said, your problem is you can't even see your need for me. Jesus like, I can't help you until you realize you need me. But when people understand how dark their world really is, then the light becomes attractive. The light becomes attractive. And that's why Christians are described as light. And let me just add this. You cannot measure dark. You can only measure light. Is that right? And you can gather light, and you can focus light, and you can intensify light, but you can't do that with dark. In other words, if it's dark, you can't grab more dark and add to it. The only way to make things dark, make a place darker, is to do what? Shut out the light. That's the only way to make a place darker, is just eliminate whatever light's coming in. And so we learned that light is infinitely more powerful than dark. Infinitely more powerful. Again, the single match lights the entire cave. Light is more powerful than dark. Dark does not chase light. Light chases away dark.
Those people in darkness don't know what they're missing.
No, they don't. And again, they don't even realize how dark, how dark their existence is. And so, as Christians, look, there's 8 billion people on this planet, right? 8 billion. And the vast, overwhelming majority of them are living in dark. They're living in dark. And sometimes it's easy for us as Christians to feel like that we're being overwhelmed by the darkness. Right? I mean, if you read the news, doesn't it feel like that we're being overwhelmed by darkness when we see the things that the news is telling us day in and day out, and we see what's on our televisions and in the music industry and the movie industry, and it feels like darkness is winning. But as long as we're light, darkness never wins. Darkness never wins in collectively as Christians or individually as Christians. As long as we are light, we always win. We always win. I'm reminded of the execution, the murder of Polycarp, who was a contemporary of John the Apostle. Polycarp was born in the late 1st century and was put to death toward the early middle part of the 2nd century. And was 86 years old when he died. And the Roman government put him to death. They burned him at the stake. And they didn't want to do it because everybody knew he was a good guy. But he refused to deny the Lord. So then they started making concessions to it. Well, you don't have to deny the Lord. Just say this about Caesar. He's like, I ain't going to do it. I ain't going to do it. It's like, you realize we're going to set you on fire. He's like, these fires are only temporary. These fires are only temporary. You think about, and the statement, and I'll paraphrase it. I won't get it exactly right. But in their earnest desire not to have to kill him, They kept making these concessions, and finally Polycarp said, 86 years I've served my Lord, and he has never denied me. He said, how can I at this point turn my back on him? In essence, with that, they lit the fire. But he understood. Light. By the way, I don't guess anybody knows the names of the people that set the fire, but his name continues on 2,000 years later. Light always wins. Abel was light in a world of darkness with his brother Cain, and Abel's name is still spoken among us as being revered among the faithful. By faith, Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, Hebrews 11 and verse 4. Light always wins. Look, they may snuff out our earthly life, our physical life, but they can't snuff out our light. Our light shines on, even after we are gone. All right, next page. The challenges. The challenges. What is the challenge of being the salt of the earth? Well, salt can preserve meat because it's not meat. In other words, hey, I need to preserve this meat. Let me add some meat to it. No, that's not going to work. Or this meat's getting old. Let me put some newer meat on it to preserve the old. No, that's not. No, salt has to be something completely different than meat in order for it to work. All right. If we're going to be the salt of the earth, then we can't be like the earth. And Jesus said, when salt loses its flavor, it's good for nothing to be cast out and what? Trodden underfoot by men. In other words, it becomes, if salt is not going to be salt, it might as well be dirt. It might as well be earth. He says it's good for nothing to be cast out and walked on just like common old, everyday dirt. There's a challenge to be, we have the challenge to be salt. We cannot make a difference in the world if we are like the world. Second paragraph, 1 John 2:15. Do not love the world or anything that's in the world. If any man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, these things are not of the Father, but of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust thereof. But he who does the will of the Lord abides forever. And it's not just about loving worldly things. It's don't love the ways of the world. Note the distinction there. Do not love the world or the things that are in the world. See, there's a distinction made there. We can love things that are in the world, or we can love the mindset or the worldview, the attitudes that pervade in the world. And John says, don't love either one of those things. And by the way, he's talking about lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and the pride of life. These are things that we have to be on guard against. Third paragraph, I'm going to make a note here. It says, consider what Paul wrote in Romans 12 and verse 2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The King James, New King James is better rendered here, where it says, be not conformed to the world, but be transformed. Because to say don't conform to the world means that you conform yourself to the world. That's not what happens. The word there is what's called a passive imperative. In other words, do not be conformed to the world means do not let the world shape you. That's what he's saying. You can't shape yourself. All of us are going to take one form or another. We're either going to take the form of Christ or we're going to take the form of the world. But we're not going to form ourselves. We're just going to submit ourselves to one or the other. If I'm going to be like the world, I'm going to let the world work on me. If I'm going to be like Jesus, I got to let Jesus work on me. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Think about the difference in conformation and transformation. In order to be conformed, you have to give in to pressure from without, right? Isn't that right? I mean, when you turn plants into coal and coal into diamonds, what has to happen? Has to be an outward pressure applied to be shaped in that way. All right? If I'm going to be conformed to the world, all I got to do is just give in to the outside pressures. That's what being conformed is. But conformed is from the outside in. Transformed is the opposite of that, right? Transformed is from the inside out. Don't be conformed. Don't let the world shape you in the shape that it wants you to be in. Be transformed. Let Christ shape you, and He'll start from the inside and work His way out. Transformation starts on the inside. If we were to think about metamorphosis, think about the monarch butterfly. The transfer, that thing is transformed, but it's not transformed because things are putting pressure on it from the outside. It's being changed from the inside and then manifests itself on the outside. Don't be conformed. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Let's see. I've already talked about some of the things in the middle of the page. Going down to light, about starting the lower half of that second page. It says there are challenges to being light. It says a city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Now there's a reason Jesus would use that terminology, and the reason is because Jerusalem was built on a hill. It was built. It was built on what we call Mount Zion. People could see it. You could see it from miles and miles away. Now, you can't hide a city. You can't hide a city on a hill. And he gives two reasons. Number one, you don't build a city in the plain because you need farmland, and number two, there are natural protections from being. Anytime you want to fight a war, you got to fight it from where? You want to fight it from the high ground, right? You don't want to be on the low ground fighting your way uphill. You want to be uphill defending from down below. By the way, this is what the Old Testament talked about when Moab and Edom thought nobody could get to them because their cities were built in the mountains. And they got pretty smug about their location and about what people could and couldn't do to them. And God's like, I don't care where you're built. I'll throw you down. The Romans might not be able to do it, or the Assyrians might not be able to do it, but God said, I'll guarantee you I can do it. He talked about their lofty minds were a part of their lofty height. They understood there were natural protections to being on the high ground. But God said, I'll bring you down. But we would think about being the city set on a hill. We don't want to be hidden. We want people. We want people to see. By the way, this happens a lot in America, but it happens a lot in other places as well. In Takoradi, which is the city where I went every time but one on my trips to Ghana. The Catholic Church built their church on top of about the tallest hill in town. They built a big fine facility right on the top of the tallest hill in town, and then built a giant steeple on top of it. Why'd they do that?
It could be seen.
It won't be seen. That's right. We don't want you. We don't want you to be able to walk anywhere in this city without being able to see where we are. I mean, they're utilizing a biblical principle, using a biblical principle. But Jesus said, as Christians, we are like a city set on a hill. And then in the next paragraph it says, no man lights a candle and puts it under a bushel or a basket. Now, obviously, when I think about a bushel or a basket, I think about some type of woven. You see them at farmers markets. The woven baskets full of fruit or full of vegetables, and that's somewhat the idea here. Somewhat the idea. But in this particular case, some of what I found was that this basket that's mentioned here is more of a bowl than a basket. And as a bowl, it would almost quench all the light. You know, if you had just a farmer's market basket and you shine the light under it, you're going to get the beams of light coming through the cracks, but you're not going to get the entirety of the light. But if the description I read is correct, with it being more of a bowl and not a basket, it not only shuts out all the light from going forward, but this, you're talking about lighting a candle, not a flashlight. Now what happens if you put a bowl over a candle? Goes out. In other words, eventually the light goes out because all the oxygen gets burned up, used up. And so Jesus is talking about, number one, the basket or the bowl not only hinders the radiation of or the radiance of our light, eventually it'll put our light out. In other words, it's not going to burn into perpetuity under some type of cover or some type of hiding. Second to the last paragraph. How do we let our light shine? It says we let our light shine through our works. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's the only way to let our light shine, is by the things that we do and say. And so light is a marvelous thing. By the way, we didn't mention it, and it's not in the book, but light is also a form of is a purifier. That a lot of people for example, in the African nations will fill not opaque, but almost clear jugs full of water that is not drinkable. But if they set it out all day long for a day or two and let the sun just shine on that water, it kills the bacteria. In other words, it purifies the water and makes it fit to drink after a short period of time. And the only thing that causes that is the light. And so we can see some. Well, you think about what do you do with a baby that's jaundiced? Lay them in the light. We brought Shelby home from the hospital, and seemed like all babies do, she started getting jaundice. And rather than take her to the doctor, she called, and they said, "Have you got a room in your house that gets direct sunlight?" I said, "Yep." I said, "Put her in it. Strip her down to her diaper and lay her, and just let the sunlight hit her, for extended periods of time." And guess what? It worked. The power of sunlight, the power of light. All right, we will start lesson. Was it 23 next week? Is that right? Yeah, lesson plan 23 next week.